Well, we are continuing our series that we started last week looking at God's questions in the Bible. And remember that God never asks a question for his own benefit. For instance, when God asks Adam and Eve, "Where are you?" it wasn't because he couldn't locate them. God and Jesus ask questions for our benefit and usually to get at something within our souls. Last week we heard how Mary Magdalene was shattered into a million pieces, but she showed up to the tomb anyway, with nothing but love. She didn't really have a plan. And while she was facing too much toward her grief at first, eventually she saw the Savior standing right behind her, and he had more than enough hot glue to put her back together. This week we are following Moses. As many of you know, I have a 4-year-old boy, and as many of you know, in fact, as anyone knows who has spoken with him, he is very comfortable stating his position on things. And so this kind of exchange happens so many times. My son asks, can I be done with dinner? And then my wife or I respond with, you need at least 3 bites of your vegetable. And then he responds matter-of-factly, but I don't want to. I bet a lot of parents out there can relate to that exchange. This text is Moses' 4-year-old moment with God. God calls him to be the leader, the deliverer of Israel, and Moses says, but I don't want to. God gets around Moses' issue and again calls him to be the leader, the deliverer of Israel, and Moses again says, but I don't want to. 4 times Moses tries to wiggle out of God's mission for him. We're going to listen in on 2 of his excuses, and we'll also listen for God's answers and also God's question. Exodus chapter 4. Then Moses answered, but suppose they do not believe me or listen to me, but say, the Lord did not appear to you. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? Moses replied, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So Moses threw the staff on the ground. It became a snake, and Moses drew back from it. Then the Lord said to Moses, reach out your hand, seize it by the tail. So he reached out his hand and grasped it, and it became a staff in his hand once more. So that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Again, the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. He put his hand into his cloak. When he took it out, his hand was leprous, as white as snow. Then God said, put your hand back into your cloak. So he put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his body. If they will not believe you or heed the first sign, they may believe the second sign. If they will not believe even these 2 signs or heed you, you shall take some water from the Nile, pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. But Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, who gives speech to mortals? Who makes them mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be your mouth and teach you what you are to speak. But Moses said, O my Lord, please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, what of your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he can speak fluently. Even now he is coming out to meet you. When he sees you, his heart will be glad. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. He shall indeed speak for you to the people. He shall serve as a mouth for you, and you shall serve as God for him. Take in your hand this staff, with which you shall perform the signs. This is the word of the Lord. So thanks be to God. Well, you know that I am a geek, and I keep tabs on the news in software and hardware much more closely than I follow most of my religious news. Josef Prusa owns one of the most famous 3D printer companies in the world. It's located in the Czech Republic. And at the beginning of this pandemic, he asked the Czech government how he could help. It was a back and forth conversation that bounced between what do you need and what do I have on hand. Prusa and his company turned to their expertise, 3D printing, and within days they had designed a 3D printed face shield approved by the Health Institute that would be useful to those healthcare workers and could be manufactured at his company's headquarters. What do you need? What do I have on hand? Two powerful questions. Limor Fried runs a similarly geeky company called Adafruit. It's in New York City. Her company also asked those two questions: what do you need? What do I have on hand? They're now manufacturing a range of protective gear and components that they wouldn't have dreamed of just a couple months ago. But Adafruit ran into a problem. They had the machines, they had the expertise, but they were running out of the raw materials they needed to manufacture. For instance, to make face shields, you need a certain kind of plastic. But supply chains around the world are totally disrupted. They couldn't get any. So they started talking in the tech community about what they were doing and what supplies they were lacking. And calls started coming in from unexpected places. For instance, Novalex called Adafruit and said, hey, that plastic that you need for face shields is the same plastic that we use to make our plastic restaurant takeout food packaging, and no one's using them right now. Here's 2,000 pounds of the right plastic you need for face shields. They were able to see the need. They were able to see what solution they had on hand. After Moses gave God his first two excuses, he raised the stakes. The people won't believe me, God. They're going to think I'm just that kooky old man. Oh, there goes old mad Moses, yapping about someone called I Am he met out in the desert, some kind of bush or something. But then the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? You see, God had already told Moses the first part of the story. Moses already knew what God was asking him to do. God needed Moses to be his emissary to Israel. Moses already knew the need, but he didn't want to do it. So God asked him the second question: what do you have on hand? Or more specifically, what is that in your hand? Staff, Moses replied. You know what he's thinking, right? I mean, Pharaoh has an army. I have a stick. Whoop-de-doo, God. But then God told him to throw the staff on the ground. And track this next part very closely, because it's easy to miss an extraordinarily important point in this. Are you with me? Did Moses turn the staff into a snake? No. He threw the staff on the ground just as God had told him to do it, and God turned the staff into a snake. Notice there were no magical words. There was no hocus pocus. Moses didn't do anything other than throw the staff on the ground as God had commanded him. This is important. Stay with me. When Moses grabbed the snake by the tail, did he turn it back into a staff? No. God turned the snake back into a staff. All Moses did was grab the snake by the tail as God had told him to do. There was no puff of smoke. There were no mirrors. There were no camera tricks. There were no superpowers involved. Moses did what God told him to do. God made it happen. When Moses put his hand into his cloak and it turned leprous, did Moses do that? No. It was God who did that. Did Moses heal his own hand? No. God did that. Are you still with me? Moses thought he had one asset: stick. Whoop-de-doo. But God highlighted here how Moses actually had three assets. Number one, he did in fact have a stick. Okay. Number two, while right now he was trying to get out of God's big task, notice that Moses was willing to do what God told him to do in the moment. He was willing to throw the staff on the ground. He was willing to pick up a snake by the tail. He had obedience to God, second asset. And his number three asset, actually should be the number one asset, he had God himself. God made the miracles happen. not Moses. Moses didn't have superpowers. Moses didn't have the force. Moses didn't get a dose of accidental radiation and develop strange abilities. Moses had three things going for him. He had a stick. He had obedience to God. And most importantly, he had God himself. But armed with those three assets, the stick, obedience to God, and God himself, with those three assets, the people of Israel walked free. Out of the three, out of a stick, obedience to God, and God himself, it's pretty easy to guess which two were the most important assets, right? I mean, yeah, that stick was only important because God chose to work through it. If someone else snuck into Moses' tent and took his supposedly magical staff, it wouldn't have done anything, right? The staff had no magic on its own. It was just a stick. But when that stick was combined with obedience to God and God himself, the miraculous happened. So why don't we ask God's question of ourselves? What is that in your hand? If God asked you to list your assets, to share what you have on hand, what's on your list? Joseph Prussia had a bunch of 3D printers and a talented design team. Lamar Freed had manufacturing equipment, a flexible and skilled staff, and oodles of goodwill in the geek community. Moses had a stick. What do you have on hand? We're not asking you to list what you don't have. We're not asking you to list what you can't do right now. We're asking what you do have. We're asking what you can do. How would you respond to God's question, what is that in your hand? When we were in Pennsylvania, we started our son Charlie on the ketogenic diet to try to treat his seizures. And this is not, again, the fad fitness keto diet you've maybe heard of. This is medically monitored inducement of a permanent state of ketosis without shutting down the body completely. It's pretty intense. And so we had to keep every bite that he ate in proper ratio, 80% fat, 20% combined carbs and protein, while getting enough nutrients. Every ingredient of everything he ate had to be weighed on a food scale to the 10th of a gram. For some people, this can actually cure epilepsy. Our next door neighbor actually had a family member who was in the initial trial group and was one of the miracle cases. This was not Charlie's miracle, but I learned something about planning through the process of being on the ketogenic diet. For the medical ketogenic diet, it is almost impossible to start with a recipe you like and then take out what you can't have. You can't start with a normal recipe and take out 90% of the carbs and protein. It's just going to be a messy lump. It won't work. We tried it. Instead, you have to create new recipes, starting with the things he can have. Whenever we tried to take away what wouldn't work, we wound up with nothing. But we could build something by starting with the ingredients that would work. My mom does something similar in her kitchen all the time. There's a lot of food allergies in our family, including my mom. And my mom, though, won't let people ask what they can't have. She will only talk about what you can have. This whole shelf of food has food that you can have with your gluten allergy. This whole shelf is available to you. This whole counter is filled with food that you can have with your dairy allergy. She only talks about what you can have, not what you can't. What can you do? What do you have? As God said to Moses, what is that in your hand? For Holy Week, we asked people to put up a sign at home or to bring a sign to the church to give a little message of hope to our community. We shared the pictures of those this last week. Did you notice how many different formats were represented for the signs? Some were made of poster board. I saw wood. Some, had actual metal stakes or frames. The columbarium had decorations made out of flowers. Last week I shared in our video interview of an Easter sign in Texas that was made from a wine rack, inspired by what we asked people to do. All of those signs were created out of what people did have on hand. Our family made a sign from foam board that we happened to have left over from something else. My boys love to draw, but they aren't making beautiful, controlled pieces of art yet. So we went with what we had. I made a basic message in Sharpie and then let them color it. And so yes, our sign featured a whole lot of Charlie doodles, lots of little Charlie circles. He loves to draw those on things. If you've ever seen the whiteboard in my office, you've seen the Charlie circles. Our sign featured a bunch of colored blobs that represented Easter eggs. And yes, if you look closely and look upside down, you might notice some things that look like Star Wars spaceships. But I told Caleb they can't be shooting at each other for an Easter sign. I didn't have any stakes for the sign, but I had some twine, so we tied it to one of the trees on our church lawn. It's not objectively beautiful. It's got to be one of the very few Star Wars-themed Easter signs in the entire world. But like Moses' stick, our sign and all the signs on the church lawn were made from what we had at hand. Like Moses, our signs came with obedience to God, and our signs came with God himself. And that can make anything miraculous. We were talking with one of the staff from the preschool that's just a few blocks away, and she had just driven by the church on her way to pick something up from the school, and she called us later, and she noticed the signs, and the signs made her smile. It gave her this sense of hope. She was uplifted, all because the people of our church used what they had on hand, were obedient to God, and God did the rest. So what do you have on hand? What can you do right now? Does it meet a need? Asked some of our ministry partners what problems they're seeing right now in our community, and Heather at Graceful Cafe shared that those who are homeless in our community are having a big problem making phone calls or getting news because no one wants to let them borrow their phone right now. I understand that. It makes total sense. Never would have thought of that as a problem, but she had noticed it. So after I talked with her last week, I ordered 2 burner phones as prototypes. Got them in my garage right now. We're going to try to get them working. If we can get everything figured out, we're going to provide some phones for the homeless in our city. And we don't really have a way of giving them out, but Graceful Cafe does. So they're actually going to hand them out if we can get this going together. The phones aren't fancy. We can only afford a couple of months of service for each phone. But during this crazy time, that's an unexpected need. And when I heard that, I thought, we can handle that. What do you have on hand? What can you do right now? Does it meet a need? If you take what you have on hand, you add obedience to God and add God himself, that can be miraculous. You might have even more objections and excuses than Moses did. You might not have, probably don't have, as many 3D printers as Joseph Prusa. You might not have as many connections as Lemore Freed. But let me ask you what God asked Moses. What is that in your hand? Amen.